plastic water bottles because we're being very sustainable. Welcome, and of course, it is so delightful to sit here with my dear friend Hina Jilani. 20 years ago, 20 years plus a few months, we were sitting down here on the floor in the rectangular table when President Carter was sitting at the head. And we were gathered at a time, as Nicole mentioned, when the whole Human Rights Project was very much under threat, and we thought it was necessary, and President Carter thought it was necessary to hear what human rights activists were saying about the impact of the post-September 11th world. They called it the new normal at the time. We had seen incidents of torture, of indefinite detention at Guantanamo, et cetera. These were incidents and behavior from the US that was quite troubling to our partners in the world who depended on the United States to be a leader on human rights. And so we wanted to hear how this would impact, but also how we could really build campaigns and movements together to think about going forward. So this is what brought us together 20 years ago. And if you'll notice the title of our conference, Unchanging Principles for Changing Times, it's full circle because we can see that the erosion of human rights has, as we spoke about, Hina spoke in her speech 20 years ago, we worried about then, and we still worry about. And so what we've been doing here for 2 days is really consulting on how do we get back to the human rights framework. And why human rights defenders? Because you have to think of human rights defenders like the canary in the coal mine. You know, the human rights defenders are the first ones to notice that there's something wrong, something is going wrong. You have arrests of journalists, you see freedom of speech being curtailed, or in case of Egypt, torture and long-term detention without fair trials, or Israel, in the case of Israel, we saw the impact of the occupation over many decades. So human rights defenders are the warning system. And so when President Carter was in office as in the White House, he actually really knew this on such a deep level, and he actually saved the lives of some of the democratic and human rights heroes that were around during his presidency. He hand-wrote a letter to Andrei Sakharov when he was on trial, which one of the leading dissidents, Sakharov, held up, for the TV cameras and says, "The President of the United States is with me," But he also did the same thing with the United States allies in Argentina, and told the Argentine junta that if they didn't release the activists, that we would withhold military aid. So this way, he stood with defenders in a consistent way that really built this idea that they are universal and that we can't be selective. So I have a question for you, Hina, because you told me when we were preparing, the first thing I have to say is when I called Hina to prepare for this session, she says, "Can I call you back in 5 minutes? There's a client waiting for me outside the police station." And it was late at night in Lahore, Pakistan, where she lives and works. And I thought, yeah, she's still at it. And she says, I'm thinking about retiring, but I can't quite do it. And we're going to talk more about that later, about what it means to really be physically present as a human rights defender. But you told me something I didn't know, which was when you were in prison in 1983, there was a very prominent person who wrote a letter on your behalf. Can you tell us what happened?
Let me first start by saying how proud I am of my association with President Carter and with the Carter Center. So thank you, Nicole, for mentioning that, and thank you for mentioning it as well, because you were there when I started. Let me tell you this story. This is 1983. President Carter is no more in office. Pakistan has the most repressive martial law since 1977. I am imprisoned in 1983. September 1983, because I had started by that time to organize the women under the platform of Women's Action Forum against all these notorious discriminatory laws imposed in Pakistan, targeting women and non-Muslim communities in the name of religion, which was a total farce. And a lot of women were arrested. Nazish, you may remember that time. I was actually arrested under a martial law regulation, and the charge against me was spreading despondency amongst the population. Now, when this man comes to arrest me, I read the charges, and I looked at him and I said, and this is, by the way, not a police officer, it's an army officer. And I said, look, you are flogging people publicly on the streets. You are holding public hangings, and I am the one who's spreading despondency amongst the population. So anyway, even for having said that, perhaps they would have charged me with further criminal acts and put me behind bars. I'm in prison, and when I get out after a month or so, the police investigator who was investigating the charges against me shows me a thick file and says, how come people from outside Pakistan are so worried about you that they're writing to the government of Pakistan with urgent appeals in your case and letters of concern? So I looked at the file, and I see some amnesty letters there, because Amnesty was holding a campaign against my detention. And then on the top of the file, I see a letter saying, President Jimmy Carter. I didn't know President Carter at that time. And it's surprising, I've never asked him about this letter. I never remember to ask him about it. So this is the man who has credibility globally, even though he's not in office. And this is a man who cares enough to write to the government, showing his concern at the incarceration of a human rights defender. And I was not the only one, by the way. Many years later, and Karen knows this, President Carter and I worked to save Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria. We weren't able to do it. We didn't save him. But his concern for the life of a human person, and especially a person who was engaged in the promotion and protection of human rights, the social and economic rights of his people. So that's why, as a human rights defender and a democracy rights activist, I think this is the kind of leadership we are now missing. We talk about a lot of crises in the world. Let me tell you, friends, the biggest crisis that we have is that of leadership. And this is something that makes the work of human rights defenders even more important. People keep saying you're a courageous person and human rights defenders are extraordinary people. We are not. We are ordinary people dealing with extraordinary situations. And I insist on saying it because we do not think that's the norm. That is an extraordinary situation. And it must remain extraordinary for us. And situations that are not normal, but require the energy and the commitment that all of you give to this work.
Thank you. And we want to talk about what we want to reflect on over the last 20 years. You know, we spoke about this 20 years ago. And what we really want from you, Hina, is, you know, what have we learned over these last 20 years since we were back, since we were together here? at the time, if you remember, there was a grave warning that if these policies continue, and today we had, for those of you who were not here, I can tell you we had an extraordinary panel on the normalization of violence and this idea that this framework of counterterrorism and militarism and that violence can actually solve problems was really unpacked and discussed very painfully but truthfully today about violence, the normalization of violence. And we spoke about it 20 years ago. So what have we learned about how violence has become normalized? But what is the antidote to this? How do we like to say that human rights will prevent, if we protect human rights, it will prevent violence. But how does that work?
I think it's a simple formula, and we are all familiar with it. Militarization has been tried all over the world. Has it helped? It has not. How then do we emphasize the essence of what we call the rule-based order? Just look at this. This is a tree that's falling. The roots are holding it. You are the roots. You are the roots that are holding it and are making sure that despite all circumstances, the principles must prevail. As a human rights defender, I see a lot of chaos in the world today. I see a lot of suffering, and I suffer with them. But at the same time, I cannot afford the luxury of pessimism. I cannot afford the luxury of cynicism about institutions, about multilateralism, about human rights systems, about human rights standards. I cannot. And when people talk to me about difficult situations, they say, well, okay, you talk about human rights, but these are not ordinary times. Human rights and humanitarian principles were not meant to be only for chaotic situations. They are just they were not meant to be only for ordinary circumstances when things were going well. They work even in the extraordinary situation and bring them back to normal. So that's why I do believe that this rule-based system does give us something. If you stick to the rules, but if you deny that there are any rules when it suits you, then what can you press for when you are asking others to stick by the rules? And I think we've heard enough this day, today, in the morning session and in the evening session, on what is happening and how there is a blatant denial of what we call the rule-based orders. Every principle is being blatantly violated, and yet we say and have justifications, and we hear these justifications every day. And I don't think that these are just accidents of a particularly bad time. These are deliberate. These are exhibition and demonstration of a power play, of the creation of the others. You and I are different, and you and I are in a relation of superiority and inferiority. That is something that we can never accept. And I say this because I have done it also in my life. The minute you become weak, and they think that it is something that is being accepted because we are feeding them spoon by spoon, and finally they will swallow it all, this cannot be done. I'll give you one story in my life. I was still a struggling lawyer, and there were some cases against me because I was participating in some protest demonstrations. These were charges, minor charges. They had the extreme penalty was some kind of a fine. And the tactic of harassment was that these cases lasted for 3 years. Every month I had to appear in court and then it would be adjourned. Now I couldn't attend to my own cases. My practice was suffering. Finally, in the 3rd year, I got so sick. There was a 500 rupee fine for that particular misdemeanor. I took out 1,000 from my pocket, and I gave 500 first to the magistrate saying, okay, finish this case. I'm paying the fine, and there is an additional 500 rupees for you for the next time, because I'm going to do it again. Because it's my right to protest. So these are some of the things, and I was just, the magistrate got so flabbergasted. He didn't know what to do. He dismissed the charges. So I think these are some of the things that we have to do to show the world that there are ways to deal with bullies. And the bullies will back off when you show them that this is not acceptable.
Wow. So the rules-based order, the rules, what are the rules? We talk about human rights, the right to free expression, the right to freedom of association. And we have extreme cases of human rights violations happening now. We heard about it earlier in the panel. We have been involved, Hina, you and I and others here, in the writing of these norms over the last decades. President Carter signed the human rights treaties when he was president. You were involved in the International Criminal Court supporting. We were also involved. So here is a case in our lifetime, but I want to go back before we talk about that to your experience investigating the situation of the Israeli occupation. Because today we heard that there were arrest warrants, or yesterday, it's a blur whether it was yesterday or today, but for both Israeli and Hamas leaders by the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is a new institution, and we were part of the campaign. President Carter supported that institution. So this is a court that is based on rules that says if you commit this crime, it doesn't matter who you are, you will be indicted. Until today, or yesterday, which day was it? I was always told this will never be used against a powerful nation or against someone with great influence. It just, to forget it, it won't ever happen. But when Vladimir Putin was indicted, people said, yay, But today, to have this indictment, it's meaningful because it means that the powerful can also be subject to the rules. So you were a member of the Goldstone Commission of Inquiry, which was the UN commission that was put together by the Human Rights Council in 2009 to investigate allegations of war crimes committed by Israel and Hamas in the CAS-led period of 2008-2009. Talk to us about what you learned in that inquiry and what might have been different if the recommendations of the Goldstone Commission had actually been listened to or adhered to.
I think things would have been very different in this world if we had respected and paid attention to the sincere efforts of some through the multilateral system to point towards the danger of impunity and to ask for accountability. I can't even imagine the situation that people like Dr. Sima Jilani have witnessed, or the 3 friends who just spoke at the panel earlier. Because I went to Gaza after CAS-led had happened. But what I saw there was so devastating and indicated more to come. And that's the important thing. And this was not only said in the report that we did as the fact-finding mission to Gaza, after Cast-Lead. This was in 2009. 2006, as the special representative of the Secretary General on Human Rights Defender, I had done a mission on Israel and Palestine. I couldn't go to Gaza during that trip, but I was in the West Bank and in several parts of Israel. I was actually in the region for about 15 days. And I can tell you that in my report to the Human Rights Council on that country visit, I had said, in not the same words, but I had almost said, this is a boiling point, and the lid is going to blow off one day. So things were happening even at that time. And these were red flags that were raised not only by myself or the Gaza mission, fact-finding mission, the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killing. They were all reporting this. And nobody was paying, nobody who mattered and who could do something about it was paying attention. What we see today in the current crisis in Gaza and the current war on Gaza is 100 times more than what happened in Cast-Lead. But even then, I can tell you, I have always had empathy for the Palestinian cause because I think there is a just cause there. I have always investigated, looked into the aberrant practices of the occupation. But when I went there to see this, the effects of everything that was happening on the people themselves, I was really taken aback. And let me tell you here the story of a woman who's recounting her experience of how her house is being bombed, and she runs out with her children and her family with a baby in her arms, and she's running, and then when she stops for breath, she sees that the baby is dead. And this woman, while she's recounting this long story, she's looking down like this, and she's talking to me. And the way she was talking, tears were rolling down my eyes, but this woman was unable to cry. And she's talking about this experience, and then she looks up at me, and she sees tears rolling down my cheeks, and that's when she lost control of herself, and she fell into my arms suddenly, and she cried after, probably having lost the capacity to cry anymore. Just the fact that there was somebody who understood what had happened to her. And I think this is something which may seem, like a over-dramatized statement that I'm making, but these are important things that we need to notice. People always said to me, Palestinians, they are undergoing so much repression, etc. They have nothing to lose. They have a lot to lose. These are people who are desperate to live, like all human beings. And I find it so difficult to understand in a world that, yesterday, Ilsa was talking about the international covenants and the human rights, the Universal Declaration, and talking about every human person is endowed with reasoning and conscience. I think these kind of incidents that we watch defies that presumption. Is every human being endowed with reasoning and conscience when we see these scenes around us? We have to make it true. We have to make it happen that every human being does get endowed with reasoning and conscience. And that is our work. And that's what we are committed to doing.
So coming back to the rules, these are rules that we want governments who have the power to commit war or to make peace or to allow free expression or to lock people up. We have these rules. And what you've just said is that the impunity in this particular, any circumstance, when you have impunity, what do you expect? It continues and it gets worse. So,
go ahead.
So what I wanted to ask is, in this time, one of the things that we wrestled with 20 years ago, and we're still wrestling with, Hina, is what do you do about terrorists? We were talking today about the frame of terrorism. And 20 years ago, we said we need the law enforcement frame because the terrorism frame, it gives too broad powers to governments. The powers are too broad, they will abuse it. That was 20 years ago we said this. And I remember 20 years ago somebody said to you, what do you do about the terrorists? What did you tell me? And tell me if you think it's still true.
Let me just say one thing about what I was saying about your previous question about the ICC. Look, there are many moments in our lives, and all of us know this and have experienced it. We go one step forward and then there are 2 steps backwards. But I've always kept my eye on the 1 step forward. Now, this indictment for me is a 1 step forward. And we should make it our endeavor to work with the ICC and do our campaigns and organize campaigns to make sure that this 1 step further takes us to a realm where accountability becomes the norm. So this is where we have to join hands and fight for this indictment to succeed and not be lost somewhere amongst our polarized political environment and our arguments on what is the right or the duty of the state. So these are some of the things that I wanted to say further to that. And on the next question, yes, human rights defenders. I come from a country which is the center of terrorism. We were the first targets, even before 9/11, of terrorism and religious extremism as the human rights community. But we are also the ones who are saying, this whole narrative that has been built around countering terrorism is flawed. It is flawed both legally and politically. What do you do with terrorists? None of us are for terrorism. We suffer because of terrorism. Our country is suffering for many, many years now, almost 4 decades, because of this terrorism. So what do we do about them? Bring them to justice, bring them to the courts. Disappearing them, killing them in extrajudicial manners is only making people lack the knowledge of what happens when you live with terrorism in your environment. And I'm talking about a time 20 years ago when there was a lot of support for these terrorists and their activities, because people were forced by the state to accept them as warriors of God. So my advice to my government had always been, bring them to the court, try them in open court, so that people understand that these are crimes that they have committed. This is not in the name of God that innocent civilians are bombed. It is not in the name of God that people are beheaded in the name of religion. And if they had followed this, now I must say, so that no misunderstanding is there, in my country now there is no support for terrorists. There isn't, because people have gone through that experience, lived it, and understood that this environment of violence has stunted progress, both social and economic in my country. Our social fabric has been ripped apart. And now that people have understood this, after many, many years, and we have lost a whole generation and their thinking is so different from what ours is. And that's why I keep saying something that is not very popular is, are we really being honest and wise when we say all our hopes is in the next generation and the young people, who we've indoctrinated into hate and intolerance? Is that where our hopes lie? So we have to reverse this, and that's our job. We have also failed as the civil society. If people are still not endowed with reason and conscience, it is also our failure, because that's our job. That's our job as human rights defenders. So we have to work harder.
So the answer is yes, you still think that, because this is what she said 20 years ago, take them to court. So you still believe this, yeah?
Yes.
No, I think this is wise because, and you said this to President Obama in 2010, you met him, and you gave him that same advice with regard to Guantanamo. Yeah. And so this is, again, we have to continue. So we're almost out of time, and we do want to leave some time for questions. But one more thing I wanted to ask you, back to the story that I started with about your client that was waiting by the police station. You told me something about how important it is to accompany people as a human rights defender. What is your advice for our young colleagues who are in the human rights field? And then we'll open for questions.
I think you want to make your presence seen. When we talk about networks, why do we talk about networks? Because that is our support system. You know, I've been under police protection for almost 25 years now. But my sense of security doesn't come from that policeman, that gun-toting policeman who walks behind me and rides with me in my car. It comes from you all. Not only do I feel secure, because there are people who surround me, I have networks, but also it gives me a sense of legitimacy of what I do. It is because you do the same thing. And I think every one of us feels safe when we look around and see, yeah, there are people who are there for us. And that's why when you ask that question, my mind goes to how young people, and I'm not saying that social media doesn't have its uses, but don't just vent your frustration on social media and forget that your physical presence on the ground, when a human rights defender is being prosecuted, for instance. Today, I'm now past 70, and I'm a fairly senior lawyer now. But I go to every court, even today, where a human rights defender is being tried. I go to every demonstration, whether it is against disappearances, against the death penalty, or commemorating Children's Day or Women's Day. We need people to be seen. So that's what I think is important. Not only for those who are being threatened and at risk at a particular time and undergoing under difficult circumstances, they are heartened by our presence. So don't forget, part of our commitment is not to talk about the networks, but to show the faces of network. You know, even when I talk about bad legislation, I have learned this lesson. Public opinion cannot be aroused by abstract discussion of discriminatory laws. You have to put a face to a problem. And I am so grateful to those victims who trusted people like Nazish, people like myself, others, trusted us with their problems enough that they were able to make them public so that the people generally understood, why are they saying this law is bad? This is the victim of that law. This woman, this person from an indigenous community, this person belonging to a sexual minority, or other religious minority or ethnic minority. This is how we get the public to respond. Abstract discussion of laws or our stories about how these laws are spreading injustice can only be understood when we give them the example of what's happening to another person. So these are some of the things I thought I'd share with all of you, although many of you here have similar experiences. And, but each of our stories brings to us a new lesson. And we've learned a lot. We made mistakes. I don't think that there is anybody sitting here who will say that the position that I was holding on a particular issue at a particular time was the ultimate truth. No. We found sometimes that things sometimes are a little different from how we have viewed them, but then we should have the courage to acknowledge it and go after the truth again. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the things I think, Karen, I thought.
Thank you so much, Hina. Please help me in thanking Hina Jilani. Well, really a treat to sit here and talk to this wonderful woman, icon, hero, but ordinary person. And we have a few minutes for any questions. I know it's a long day, but please come to the microphone. And any of our guests who weren't here today but might have questions, please feel free.
Hello and good evening. Thank you very much for being an inspiration. My name is Joel from the Philippines. I'm just curious. I had a discussion with a friend from Georgia who has been working on queer rights in her country, and she stopped for a year, and she was very, very guilty for doing so because she said when she stopped, things worsened. And there's this guilt amongst people who are burnt out and felt that, oh, they should have done more. What's your take on it about burnout and sort of glorification of human rights defenders at risk? That we sort of need to be at risk in order to be recognized or to be given more attention to. And I think on a personal note also, and I've discussed this with my colleague from Chittagong, how did you take care of your health, of your mental, physical health? And how did you stay this long and endure this whole world of troubles and challenges? Thank you very much.
I don't know, I can only say for myself personally, as I can't afford pessimism, I can't afford burnout either. And how do I care for my health? Things are not always the worst. We have changed the world, let's not forget that. Our work has not been totally useless. We have won victories. Even the small victories are the victories that give me or anybody else who's in this field the energy to go on. Like I said, keep your eye on the one step forward. That gives you enough relief from frustration, for one thing. Things are not so bad. And we have changed the world. On the women's issues, for instance, we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. But don't forget, we have come a long way. I remember, and Nazish, you will remember this too. In my country, honor killings were a part of the the culture. And I remember a young woman who was in the shelter that I managed for for women. She was also my client, and she was sitting in my room, in my office. And she was killed by an assassin brought in by her own family, right next to me. And I, by chance, escaped. But I still have some marks on my ear where the bullet singed my ear. But the thing is, we lost that woman. But at the same time, that was the turning point. And today in Pakistan, nobody can publicly say that honor killing is a part of our culture or a part of our religion. They may still believe it, but they can't say it publicly. Whether it's a politician, a journalist, an academic, anyone, they can't say it anymore. No judges can say this. And I remember when I started practicing in that notorious period of martial law, and we were taking cases of women who were victims of these notorious laws to court. Judges were saying to me, for instance, in their judgments, they were saying, these frustrated divorcees, women are the temptresses. They were giving bail to those who had molested young girls of 10 years old and then produced a marriage certificate saying, no, she's his wife, so that he escapes the charge of raping her. And the judge said, and these are things that we have had to tolerate from courts. The judge said, well, at best, it's the misuse of the wife. She's a 10-year-old child. It's a misuse of the 10-year-old wife, at best, and gave this man, the rapist, a child molester, bail. These things have changed. Nobody dares to say this again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we are out of time, but I'm going to take the 4 questions and then we'll answer them all at the end.
Thank you for this inspiration night. Really, I'm Josephine from Lebanon, but what I just look now, a woman was in prison like 40 years ago. And on the break, I was talking to my friend from Tunis, Monsef. He told me that another active woman, she's on prison right now, and we know her, and she's fighting for the rights. So do we need to wait and to repeat ourselves on the same strategy? It's not time to really find the leaders, like you said, we need the leader. And now all the international community are empowering the leaders, what we have it. It's not time to unempower these leaders and to try to be on a network like these people here to find the right leaders for the truth. It's time to change the strategy, to not repeat ourselves and to lose our friends and our colleagues and our fighters for the rights. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Buson Hlabatsi. I'm from Swaziland. Mine is a direct question. I must say that you are a breath of fresh air. But on a personal level, have you ever felt at some point that the cause is not worth it? You felt like you had to give up, and you felt like the risks were very high, and maybe people who were very close to you felt like you were also putting them at risk. And at that point, what kept you going, and what gave you the courage to say the cause is worth it? That's just my question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Musa. I'm from Mali, West Africa. So my question joined my colleague. So where do you get the light, the energy when everything gets dark around you? I know we all have courage, but at certain time, you wonder yourself if I should keep going. So I know you have your own why, you're explaining to us, but when you feel like you are all alone, going against the wall, what keeps you moving forward? Where this energy comes from? Where this light comes from? Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Pour la traduction, je suis désolée, je peux parler en français plus facilement. Du coup, je vais intervenir en français, si vous permettez. Sorry. Yeah, there is translation for French. 7. Je peux? D'accord. Je suis Yosra Frawes, je suis tunisienne et de la Fédération internationale des droits humains. Je suis basée en France depuis une année. Après le coup d'État, j'ai reçu des menaces, donc j'ai dû quitter le pays. Mais ce que je voulais vous dire, au fait, c'est vous faire une première confidence. J'ai toujours, jusque-là, refusé d'assister dans une activité organisée par une institution américaine. Parce qu'il m'a été toujours difficile de faire la distinction entre les politiques américaines, notamment la militarisation dans le monde, les guerres, l'appui aux dictateurs dans la région MENA et les organisations de droits humains. Mais cette fois-ci, j'étais tentée, avec tout ce qui se passe dans le monde, au Soudan, à Gaza, en Ukraine, j'ai comme une conviction que nous sommes en train de vivre une nouvelle ère. Je me suis dit, pour une nouvelle ère, il faut contacter d'autres gens, voir d'autres gens. Et je vous dis que je ne le regrette pas du tout. Au contraire, je suis fière d'être venue et très heureuse grâce à ces magnifiques femmes et hommes que j'ai rencontrés. La deuxième chose, c'est une question, surtout à vous, madame, qui est...
Let me just tell the crowd.
Ah, sorry, you will translate to me.
Just quick. Our guest is from Western Sahara and
From Tunisia, sorry.
From Tunisia. Oh, sorry. You said sorry. Maghreb. From Tunisia, but had previously not wanted to participate in an American conference, but because of the times, maybe these times are different, and she's actually quite proud to be here with us. But you have a question.
Yeah.
Because of that, I
very
didn't
good
explain
brief,
the whole
yeah.
thing about the critique about U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
Normally, she would not come to an American conference because of American foreign policy and the war in her region, but she is glad to be here.
Yeah, and I'm proud to be here today. Ma question, c'est par rapport à ce qui se passe justement dans le monde. Parce qu'avant, nous, défenseurs des droits humains, féministes, militants, nous sommes traités de traîtres, de complotistes, d'agents de l'étranger. Et il y avait justement, madame l'a dit très bien, il y avait un leadership international. Les États-Unis avaient le leadership sur la question de démocratie. Elle inspirait, elle poussait le monde à devenir démocratique. Mais en ne jamais faisant le lien entre démocratie et occupation. Le problème, ça ne s'associe pas à démocratie et occupation. Et donc, ça nous fragilisait. Mais aujourd'hui, avec les doubles standards, on n'est plus écouté en tant que défenseur de droits humains. On nous dit, voilà, vous êtes en train de suivre les Américains, vous êtes en train de suivre les Européens qui disent qu'ils ont des valeurs, mais finalement, ils n'ont pas de valeurs. Regardez comment ils ont agi avec l'Ukraine et maintenant comment ils se comportent avec le Soudan ou Gaza. Regardez comment ils sont en train de traiter avec les Africains qui vivent des coups d'État et qui sont en train de balancer chez Poutine. Et c'est très grave de voir une partie du monde balancée dans les plus rétrogrades. Donc ma question, c'est comment faire en tant que défenseur de droits humains pour ne plus être isolé par rapport à nos communautés, pour avoir des arguments, pour voir qu'il y a un leadership réel et pour pouvoir changer ce narratif qui nous met toujours dans le danger d'être traités comme des vendus de l'Occident.
Okay.
Et merci beaucoup, je suis désolée.
Oh, thank you. Okay. It's a long question, but we will treat it at the end of the other questions. But thank you, Paige. I have it here. I think you got it.
I think I'll reply to all the questions together. Sorry. I'll reply to all the questions together. I think they are also similar. First of all, how do you react to the realities that surround us? I don't think that we really need to give up. What we need to do now, like the question from the Philippines, for instance, we have to shake up the systems. We have to shake them up. And we did that in 1993 on the Women's World Conference. We did that in the 1993 Human Rights Conference and the 1995 Women's Conference. We did it. We created international global networks of women. Look at the strong women's global network became, how strong it became by the time we came to the 1995 World Conference. Look at the human rights networks that grew just before the 1993 World Conference. And governments had to listen to us. The United Nations opened its doors to the civil society. Don't let them shut those doors in our face. Put your foot in. And that's what we need to do. The other thing that was said is, where do you get your energy? Dear friends, what other alternative do I have? Look, don't underestimate ever the power of outrage. Don't underestimate that power, because that's what drives us. If you see things that are unacceptable to you, you can't turn your face away. You can't turn your face away from justice and keep whining and becoming cynical. You have to do something about it. And that's what our job is. If we are worth anything, it's because we do not see an alternative to our struggle. For me, it is my struggle that I believe in. If I stop struggling, there is no hope. For as long as I struggle, at least I have hope that something is there at the end of the tunnel. And we have found many lights at the end of the tunnel. Let our own experiences teach us that these struggles have produced something. Yes, there is backsliding. But then, again, as I said, what alternative do you have? I don't work as a human rights defender only because I care for others. I care for myself too. I don't want to live in an environment where there is suppression, there is injustice, there is blatant disregard for any principles and fairness and humanity. So if you can't just take poison and die, you have to live. So why not strive to live in a good environment? So that's worth it.
Just the last question, thank you, Paige, for this, because it helps. Because the point of, I think, our guest from Tunisia is that sometimes human rights defenders are accused of being sort of agents of the West, you know, this because of the, so this is, I think, the gist of her question. How do she came here, it's not natural maybe in these times to affiliate with an American effort because of the idea that you could be accused of this, being an agent of the West. So what's
I've been accused of being an Indian agent, a Russian agent, a Chinese agent, a British agent, an American agent. I don't care. And also, I'm very careful. I know the realities. I know these realities because I'm in the business of changing these realities. So nobody's intentions, selectivity, dual, what do you call it, dual, measures, double standards. I know all this, but I don't want to make a second set of others and us. These people confront me by saying, oh yes, the world is, what do you do? It's an unfair world, it's an unjust world. Well, friends, this is a reality we want to change. So I'm not going to accept that reality. And I don't think any of you accept it. The very fact that you're sitting here today and telling us all about the work that you do, you are changing realities. And a lot of changes will come. Even look at the whole question of what's happened recently in Gaza. Where did we start last year? And today, the very people who are arguing with us, the right of self-defense, justification, terrorism, etc., are now on the defensive. It is because, again, as I said, it is the outrage that they had to confront that has made them slightly more cautious about the way that they are adding insult to injury and rubbing salt in the wounds. It's not the Palestinians alone. When Palestinians suffer, when war in Ukraine happens, the essence of peace becomes even more clear to us, for all of us. When I was listening to the story of Dua and her family and her two brothers, I was crying, but these were not just tears of sadness. I was angry that this is happening. Where is the human person and human being that is endowed with reasoning and conscience? That's what we have to do. Make sure that reasoning and conscience becomes the reality, the lens through which people look at what is happening around us.
Well, thank you again to the remarkable Hina Jilani for joining us this evening, and to Karen Ryan for guiding us through such